Welcome to the museum. I'm Sarah Bloomfield, its director. I'm delighted to have all of you and all of our web viewers around the country tonight joining us for what I can assure you will be a fascinating program. Before we begin, I just have to mention a very sad note, and that is the passing of a very close friend and colleague of this institution, Dr. David Cesarini, one of the leading Holocaust scholars in the world. He was a professor at the University of London and died tragically at the sad age of 58 over the weekend. So for tonight's program, in 2010, the world of Holocaust studies was abuzz with the publication of Bloodlands, Tim Snyder's important book about those lands caught between Soviet, Nazi, and then again Soviet rule, and the 14 million people murdered there between 1933 and 1945. Some called it a field-changing book. It certainly got the field of Holocaust studies talking, and it provoked a great discussion about many things. There was consensus that its focus on the centrality of the events of Eastern Europe was a significant contribution to a much-needed trend of study moving away from Central and Western Europe to Poland and the former Soviet Union. But Bloodlands also raised what some considered contentious issues about the role of anti-Semitism, the nature of local collaboration in the Bloodlands, and the distinctions between Nazism and Soviet communism. And now, a mere 5 years later, Tim Snyder has produced an even more provocative book in Black Earth. And the field of Holocaust studies is again abuzz. But this time, the discussion extends well beyond Holocaust scholars to thought leaders, literary critics, and other public intellectuals. Tim now brings his impressive intellect and his unbelievable language skills, 11 of them, if you can imagine that, to a consequential, some might say controversial book about the biggest questions posed by the Holocaust. Questions about human societies, about politics, ideologies, power, and states, and questions about human nature, about hate, fear, greed, and self-justification, the things that motivate all of us at times, and even questions about whether the Holocaust even holds lessons for the future. Now, in reviewing Bloodlands, the historian Istvan Deák wrote this. He said, "Snyder ends his unbearable tale with an eloquent plea." And here Deák is quoting Tim Snyder from the book. "The Nazi and Soviet regimes turned people into numbers. It is for us as humanists to turn the numbers back into people. If we cannot do that, Hitler and Stalin have shaped not only our world, but our humanity." Deák goes on to say, "This is exactly right. This is an important book. I have never seen a book like it." But then he says, "But even Snyder does not broach the problem of explanation. Why was there so much savagery in the Bloodlands?" So now, with this book, almost as if answering Professor Deák, we have here tonight Professor Tim Snyder to offer his very intriguing analysis on what we at the museum call the why question. Professor Snyder will come up and deliver a presentation on his thesis. And then after that, my colleague, Dr. Stephen Luckert, our senior program curator, will conduct an interview with Professor Snyder and then open it up to you for questions. So now it's my great pleasure to invite a good friend of this institution, Professor Timothy Snyder.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation to speak about this book here at this institution, which is so important to me and to so many other scholars. The question that I will be addressing is precisely the why question, the question which I think is particularly demanding today as we move out into the round anniversaries where there will be no more survivors, as we ask ourselves how the Holocaust can become part of the past when we're used to hearing the voices of those who lived through it. We're at the moment where I think we're dependent more upon history than ever before. Memory and history are always in a conversation. Commemoration and understanding are always in a conversation. This is going to be a presentation about interpretation, about understanding. What I'd like to try to do is to suggest that there are some basic problems of explanation and to suggest that there is a way to solve them. What are these basic problems? The first has to do with geography. There are essentially two places where we talk about the Holocaust, and we talk about them in essentially incompatible ways. The first place is in Germany. If you read classic works of Holocaust scholarship, as I assume you do, because otherwise you wouldn't be spending your evening with me here today, for which thanks, you will learn a great deal about Germany between 1933 and 1938, 39, 41. The problem with this approach is that the Holocaust didn't happen in Germany, and it didn't happen in those years. I would go further and say that it could not have happened in Germany, and it could not have happened in those years. Some German Jews were killed, to be sure, about half of them, but all of them were killed later and beyond the borders of pre-war Germany. Or to put it a different way, 97% of the Jews who were killed in the Holocaust are Jews who have nothing to do with Germany whatsoever, except for the fact that they were killed by German power. 97%. That is to say, 97% of the Jews who died in the Holocaust did not experience the story with which we are so familiar, the story of Nuremberg laws, second-class citizenship, expropriation, Aryanization, immigration. They didn't experience that story, but they died anyway. That's 97% of the story. Or to put the point still more strongly, the place where all of the Jews in the Holocaust die, essentially all of them, with very, very few exceptions, is a zone, as I say, not in Germany, a zone beyond Germany, but a very special zone, a zone where German power destroyed conventional states. This is the place in Eastern Europe where most of the European Jews lived before the Holocaust began, but it's also the place where Jews from Western and Central and Southern Europe were sent to die. This is one more reason to suggest that learning about the German state is not enough. We have to ask ourselves what the German state did to its neighbors, how it transformed so much of Europe into a place where killing could happen. The second way that we discuss the Holocaust, and Sarah alluded to this, is that we consider anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitism of Germany's neighbors, which of course is an important factor in explanation. What I'm afraid happens all too often, though, is that it comes in as explanation when we don't have another explanation. We treat it as a kind of default. When we're not sure what's happening, we say, well, Romania was anti-Semitic, or Poland was anti-Semitic, or France was anti-Semitic, which is fair enough. But if anti-Semitism is going to be the explanation, we're left with a couple of major problems. The first is that there is no correlation whatsoever between how anti-Semitic a country was and how many Jews live or die. Simply none. The second problem that we have is the timing. If anti-Semitism is a source of Holocausts, why did the Holocaust start in the summer of 1941 and not in the previous 600 years of Jewish settlement in Eastern Europe when there was plenty of anti-Semitism? There's also the particular question, which I'm going to try to answer, the question of the mechanism. Even if anti-Semitism is part of your explanation, you need some way to show how thought becomes action. That's not a simple question at all. Just how anti-Semitism might become killing is not as straightforward as it might seem. What I'd like to suggest is that the only way we could have a true Holocaust history would be to have both of these things in the picture. To have Germany from 1933 to 1938, but to have Germany in the picture in a way which explains how it could destroy its neighbors and have some notion of what happened in its neighbors during that destruction. Which, by the way, means the history has to start with countries beyond Germany. This may seem like a very simple point. But again, if you'll remember the way the Holocaust is usually narrated, other countries only appear over the horizon at the moment they're going to be destroyed. If it's true that it matters where Jews lived, and it does matter, if it's true that the process of state destruction has a great deal to do with how they died, then we need to know something, at least a little bit, about the states where they lived before German power reached them, which is one more reason why the Holocaust has to be not just a German history, and not just a Jewish history, but an international one. Now, let me try to press this point a bit stronger and see if I can reach a point of moral sensitivity, because not enough of you are shaking your heads yet. So let's work on that. When we fall back on the explanation of the German state, or when we fall back on the explanation of the anti-Semitism of East Europeans, we risk, I think, taking part in a way in the intellectual legacy of the Holocaust itself. So it is true to this day that East Europeans, when they try to explain the Holocaust, the first vernacular stereotype is to say, well, of course, the Germans were extremely organized, and therefore they were able to do this, right? That is an ethnic stereotype. It actually has nothing to do with the way the Germans carried out the Holocaust, which was extremely disorganized for the most part. But the basic point is, if you're an East European and you say, oh, those organized Germans, what are you doing? You're displacing causality and therefore responsibility. And what about Germans, who to this day very often will appeal to the tendency of East Europeans to carry out pogroms or anti-Semitism as an obvious cause, right? And use words to describe East Europeans, which they probably wouldn't use to describe themselves or other West Europeans. What is this? It's also a displacement of responsibility, because if East Europeans are just barbaric anti-Semites who immediately rise up and kill Jews as soon as you give them the smallest provocation, well, that means it wasn't really Germany's fault. Germany was just trying to fight a war like everybody else, and these East Europeans rose up and killed all the Jews. Now, that's a vernacular stereotype, and there's another one, which is even more sinister, and that is the idea that Jews were communists and communists were Jews, another ethnic stereotype, which arises directly from the Holocaust itself. And we're going to see how important it was in the Holocaust. But think about it in terms of a current stereotype. If East Europeans say communists were Jews and Jews were communists, what are they doing? Are they describing a situation? No, that situation, of course, never actually happened. What they're describing is a reason that was given for murder. And here's the terrifying thing. If people are killed for a lie, the lie has to become true. We're very good at murdering. We're even better at lying. But the thing that we don't seem to be able to do as a species is admit that we killed for a lie. The reason why we killed has to become true. And the stereotype of Jews being communists and communists being Jews is a good example of that. But in general, it's an example of how ideas which are familiar to us, because I think everyone in here has heard all three of these cliches, the organized Germans, the barbaric East Europeans, and the communist Jews. I barely get through a day of my life without hearing all three, frankly. I'm sure you've heard all of these stereotypes. They are not innocent, is my point. They actually arise from the Holocaust to some extent. They have something to do with the Holocaust, and in partaking in them, we are partaking in some way in its history. So the case that I want to try to make is that we need to be able to build a history of the Holocaust, which is not just international, as I've said, but also political or universal in a way which gets control over these stereotypes and builds up some other kind of explanation. Now, the news is not all bad. It's mostly bad, but the news is not all bad. There is also some opportunities for explanation. The first of these has to do with sources. In the last 25 years, since the end of communism, we have seen, I think, the most important and interesting opening of archives in the history of the world. The lands beyond the Iron Curtain, the lands east of the Iron Curtain, are exactly the places where the Holocaust took place. The line east and west is almost perfect, which meant that for 45 years, we had theories of the Holocaust developing in Western Europe, whereas most of the evidence that one would have needed was actually in Eastern Europe. That has now changed. And for people who can read Russian or Yiddish or Polish or Hungarian or some of these languages, an entirely new picture of the Holocaust can emerge. The second bit of good news is that there are now fields in social sciences and the history about genocide itself. And the interesting thing about Nazi Germany, and I think a new answer to the question how Nazi Germany was special or singular or different, or how this crime we're talking about was unprecedented, is this. This is going to be a very scholarly answer, but I think it's interesting. In the social sciences, in the last 25 years, since Srebrenica, since the war in Yugoslavia, there have been hundreds and hundreds of studies about the political preconditions for ethnic cleansing and genocide. The basic finding is ethnic cleansing and genocide happen when a state fails, when there's civil war, when borders change. That's the basic finding. There is another school of analysis. It's the historians. The historians say the only kind of state that can kill its own citizens in large numbers, what kind of state? A party state. Cambodia, People's Republic of China, the Soviet Union. What is Nazi Germany? Nazi Germany is the one example in history that brings both of those trends together. It's a party state, but it's a party state that kills citizens beyond its own borders. And it kills people beyond its own borders by artificially generating state collapse. That is what Nazi Germany was. Nazi Germany was an ideological party state, the ideology of which was not so much about transforming Germany, but about transforming the entire planet. And the conditions for this transformation, as Hitler explicitly says in Mein Kampf, have to do with destroying political institutions as they exist. Okay, now let me try to make this case. Let me begin with ideology. Hitler's ideology is much, much more radical than we generally assume. If we think of Hitler as a nationalist, we have it wrong. He was indifferent to the German nation. If we think of Hitler as an authoritarian, that's also wrong. He was essentially indifferent to the German state. If we think of Hitler as an anti-Semite, that is correct, but the word itself, I think, doesn't quite capture the enormity of what Hitler was about. Hitler's view of the world was, there is only one reality, and that is the reality of racial struggle. We belong to races the same way that animals belong to species. Races, like species, have only one task, and that task is to control land and take food from others. All that really ever happens in the world is that races struggle, take, and kill. Here's where the anti-Semitism comes in, and you'll see how it's so radical and why this is so important. If you think that anything is happening in the world besides racial struggle, that means you have been influenced by the Jews. Because every idea, says Hitler, whether it's communism or capitalism, whether it's the law, whether it's the state, whether it's Christianity or some other religion, any idea which allows for a notion of human solidarity or human reciprocity, any idea that allows two people to see each other as members of humanity rather than as members of races, this idea must be Jewish. So it follows from that the Jews must be removed from the face of the earth. This is the end of chapter 2 of Mein Kampf. Jews have to be removed from the face of the earth because they have destroyed the planet. They have undone the laws of nature, or really the law of nature, the law of racial struggle. If Jews can be removed from the planet, then the struggle can begin. Now, Hitler also says two other very interesting things about Jewish responsibility. Jews are responsible not just for ethical ideas, socialism, Christianity. Those ideas, by the way, for Hitler are all the same idea. Hitler thinks that St. Paul and Trotsky were the same person. He refers to St. Paul as the political commissar of Christianity. And this is no accident. For Hitler, all ethical ideas, all of them are basically the same idea. Any idea of reciprocity is a Jewish trap. But what I wanted to say is, Hitler also claims that universal science is a Jewish trap. And these are passages that are forgotten that I think are incredibly interesting. If there were the promise of scientific progress, right? Let's imagine that there were agricultural science. Let's imagine that the 1930s were an age of pesticides and fertilizers and the hybridization of crops and the development of irrigation, which they were. That would be a problem for Hitler's argument, because that would mean perhaps we don't have to struggle for land all the time. So Hitler very explicitly says that any idea of universal science, which gives us the promise of peace rather than struggle, right? The promise of prosperity by way of scientific thought rather than blood. That idea, says Hitler, is Jewish. Now, this is incredibly important because it closes down the future. It's a way of generating what I call in the book ecological panic. If life really is just a struggle for more and more, And if any idea that might save you from that, whether it's ethical or scientific, is a Jewish idea, that means that the struggle must begin right away. And here we begin to see how Hitler's ideas could be political, how this ideology could move towards politics. Let me try this by appealing to your emotions. What is, what is Lebensraum? What is Lebensraum? Lebensraum is a German word that we use to distance ourselves from a very important idea. Let me try to bring us closer to it. Lebensraum is two ideas. The first of them is a biological analogy. Hitler says species need habitat. Habitat and Lebensraum are the same thing. Races are like species. Therefore, since ethics don't matter and science doesn't work, we must struggle to get ever more and more and more. But in the second book, Hitler makes a very interesting argument, a complementary argument. He says, it's not just that we're like animals and we need more and more. It's also that we're people, we're families, and we want more and more. Right? He says explicitly, the standard of living of German families is to be measured not objectively, not absolutely, but subjectively and relatively. German families will always want, he says this explicitly, will always want as much as American families have, right? The American dream has to be the German dream. So standards of living have to rise and rise and rise. Okay, here comes the appeal to your emotions. You can pretend I'm not reaching you. On the one side, Hitler, thank you. On the one side, Hitler is saying, if you're afraid about the future, if you're concerned about survival, if you believe your children and grandchildren might not have enough, you're right. Be afraid. There's no reason not to be afraid. We should take everything now. On the other hand, Hitler is simultaneously saying, if you want more and more, if you want an ever higher standard of living, if you believe that consumer satisfaction should be endless without limit, you're right. You should want more and more. And anyone who tells you otherwise is a Jew. Okay? So do you begin to feel the emotional? Well, you don't have to answer yes or no. Okay, I've already seen enough nods from the crowd. It's kind of unsettling. So the idea is that this makes this ideology take a step towards politics. Now, Lebensraum has a geography, and now we take another step closer to how the Holocaust could happen. The geography of Lebensraum, the place of Lebensraum, is Ukraine. So the natural struggle, the racial struggle, when it begins, is going to be a German war for Ukraine. Why is Ukraine so important? Well, Ukraine brings together Hitler's two great preoccupations. It brings together the two sides of his ideology. On the one hand, Ukraine is the place which has the most fertile soil in Europe. Then and now, by the way, Hitler's perfectly right about that. On the other hand, Ukraine is controlled by the Soviet Union, which Hitler defines as a German state, as a Jewish state. So a German war to gain Ukraine is a blow both against the barbarian Ukrainians who have this land and shouldn't have it, and against the world Jewish conspiracy at the same time. This is the war that everything is leading up to. Okay, but how does Hitler actually get Germany into that war? We can already begin to see the shape of how that war might lead to a Holocaust. It will be an anti-Semitic war, it will be about destroying the Soviet Union, and it will be a war that takes place in the territories where the huge majority of European Jews live, between Germany and Eastern Ukraine. That's just the beginning of an explanation, though. How can Hitler possibly get Germans to fight this war? And here's where I think we have to rethink the 1930s. The narrative of the 1930s in Germany, the idea that over the course of the 1930s, all of the things that you need for a Holocaust are accumulated by way of discrimination or expropriation or the separation of Jews from other people. I think we have to revisit that rather seriously. I think we have to reconsider the 1930s, not as a time when a Holocaust was prepared, because let's face it, it wasn't. No Holocaust happened in Germany in the 1930s, and no Holocaust could have happened in Germany in the 1930s. It is rather a time of the creation of potential. What kind of potential? The potential to destroy other states. Let me just revisit with you very briefly things that you will know about Germany in the 1930s. Consider the concentration camps. What is the definition of a concentration camp? A concentration camp is a lawless zone. It's a zone where the state does not appear. It's precisely a place in German practice, not only in German, where normal rules do not apply, right? It is specifically a place where not where the state punishes people, but where the Nazi party punishes people. And by no accident, the camps in Germany in the 1930s were run by the SS. What is the SS? It is not a political organization. It's a racial organization. One has to take that seriously. It's a racial organization that changes the German state, but it's also a racial organization whose fundamental task is to destroy other states. Once we see that, then the realm of possibility begins to open up. If a Holocaust is not possible in Germany, where can it take place beyond Germany? How can it take place? It can take place as statelessness replaces normal politics. So now let's revisit some scenes, which I'm sure you will all know. Think of the scene of Austrian Jews scrubbing the streets of Vienna on March 11th and thereafter. Let's say March 11th, 1938. What is happening in this scene? What is happening? Austria did not have laws discriminating against Jews. It didn't have Nuremberg laws. It didn't have expropriation. And yet, literally, from one day to the next, from March 10th to March 11th, Jews are humiliated on the streets of Vienna and other Austrian cities in a way that would have been impossible in Nazi Germany. How could that have happened? It happened because the Austrian state was destroyed. From one moment to the next, Austria ceased to exist. There's a reason why essentially every Jewish family broke the Sabbath that Friday night, it happened to be a Friday, and listened to the Chancellor of Austria say he would not defend Austrian sovereignty. The reason is they knew what it was going to mean. The next morning, the scenes that you're familiar with, the big circles of smiling or smirking faces, perhaps an SA man in the center holding a dog whip, and a Jew, or perhaps several Jews, scrubbing the streets. What are they scrubbing? They're not actually just scrubbing the streets. It's not an empty ritual of humiliation. They're scrubbing off the word Austria, Österreich. That and that alone. There was going to be a referendum on the 15th of March about the continuation of the Austrian state. When Jews scrub the word Österreich from the streets, when they're forced to do this, they're being associated with the prior regime. It's not just humiliation, it's also politics. It's the micro-politics at the beginning of the final solution. They're being blamed for the previous regime, even though, of course, they didn't have anything more to do with it than anyone else. And when, of course, they are later killed, that blame is going to go away. I'm just going to mark something here with a little asterisk. Where are they going to be killed? The largest number they're going to be killed near Minsk. Let's just raise the question, why Minsk? Okay. Czechoslovakia. Now, like Austria, Czechoslovakia has a national story. If you care about Austria, you know about the Anschluss. If you care about Czechoslovakia, you know about Munich, or what the Czechs called the betrayal at Munich. And it was indeed a betrayal. But the history is not just a national one. When states are destroyed, even imperfect states, the people who suffer the most are the Jews. And in these particular conditions, we can see how the removal of Jews from a state is a very important first step towards their murder. It's actually not that hard to see. Czechoslovakia is destroyed in late 1938 and early 1939. Let's ask what happens to the Jews of Slovakia. The moment when a state is destroyed, everyone floats free and citizenship is redefined. The Jews of Slovakia are defined constitutionally as second-class citizens. Then by legislation, they're deprived of their property rights. This creates an artificial Jewish question. Where did all of these poor Jews come from, right, is the way that it's faced. And the solution, I'm using the language of the time, is to deport them somewhere far away, which was a camp called Auschwitz. The Slovak Jews are the first Jews deported in large numbers to Auschwitz. What happens to the Jews of eastern Czechoslovakia, of Subcarpathian Ruthenia? A lot of this territory is taken by Hungary. I'm sorry this is complicated, but it's really important. This territory is taken by Hungary. Hungary doesn't recognize the Jews on this territory as its citizens. They float free. When the moment comes, when they can, Hungary deports these people to the east. It's the summer of 1941. Hungary deports them into Soviet Ukraine, right into the path of the Wehrmacht. These Jews then become the first victims of a mass shooting. The first victims of a mass shooting in the sense of more than 10,000 people shot, not only in the Holocaust, but in the history of the world. The mass murder at Kamyanets-Podilsky in August of 1941, where 23,600 people are shot. So the dismantling of a state is creating these populations, which not long after are going to be killed. But we should remember, they're not killed where they live, they're killed somewhere else. They have to be pushed eastward into a zone where the state has been destroyed. Poland, September of 1939. Poland is the first time when the Germans destroy a state while invading it. The Germans go into Poland in September of 1939 with the Wehrmacht invading from three sides, and they bring with them special task forces known as Einsatzgruppen. The Einsatzgruppen enter Poland in September 1939 with precisely the task of making sure that a Polish state is impossible and will never be possible. They are assigned the job of physically eliminating, murdering the Polish political elites. Germany then announces when the war is over that the Polish state does not exist, and here's where it gets interesting, has never existed. In other words, Poland is treated the way that European states often treat colonial possessions. Whatever political structures are found are declared not to have existed. So in legal terms, Poland is declared not only not to exist, but never to have existed. I had a little trouble with my English grammar there. I've been touring Europe. It's all going to come back to me, though. It's all going to come back. What does this mean? Well, it means, to make one obvious point, what are ghettos? Ghettos are a result, among other things, of the end of the Polish Civil Code. Nothing like that is possible where there's a normal bourgeois civil code in effect with property rights. Let's consider a couple of other things, though. What about some institutions in interwar Poland which were actually there, in some measure at least, for the good of the Jews? In interwar Poland, any Jewish community of any size had autonomy. It had a gmina, it had a kehela, it had a group of respected people who represented the interests of the community to the central state, and was responsible for things like kosher slaughter, for marriage, for birth, for death, for receiving money from abroad. When the Germans come in 1939, these same people become the Judenrat, right? And then they do different things. The same people, but they do different things because the institutions have changed. Or the Polish police. The Polish police in 1939 spent a lot of time trying to stop pogroms. Why? Because anti-Semitism was very widespread in Polish society, because the largest opposition party in Poland was deliberately organizing pogroms, and because the police are defenders of bourgeois law and order. When the Polish state is destroyed, did these policemen run to the Germans? No, for the most part, they fight against the Germans. But then they make the decision to collaborate. Once they collaborate, as many of them do, they find themselves in a different structure, following different orders. And by 1942, 1943, the very same men who are stopping pogroms in the small towns of Poland are hunting down Jews in the countryside and killing them. Were they helping Jews because they like them? Probably not. Are they killing Jews because they always hated them? Perhaps, but I would suggest that the change of institution is probably the decisive thing. In fact, I would go further and say, in a country where popular anti-Semitism is so broad, it's precisely there that the state is important. It's precisely there that the destruction of the state matters so much. But still, we don't have a Holocaust. We still don't have a Holocaust. What we have are ghettos. We have German ideas of deporting Jews. But even as late as the spring of 1941, there is no Holocaust taking place. Jews in the ghettos are dying in very large numbers, but there has been, as of yet, no mass murder. How is it going to happen? Well, let me start with the easier question. Where is it going to happen? It's going to happen in the Soviet Union. Okay? And here we have to make I'm afraid, a very complicated point, but you will see how it all comes clear. If state destruction is bad, if state destruction creates the opportunities for certain kinds of micropolitics, which make killing more likely, double state destruction is even worse. The territories of Eastern Poland and Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were subjected to something which is unique, as far as I know, in modern history. Namely, these territories were subjected to 2 policies of state destruction over the course of a matter of months. 10 months for the Baltics, 23 months in Eastern Poland. When the Germans invade Poland in 1939, and this is really, really, really important, when the Germans invade Poland in 1939, they do so with a Soviet ally. The Soviets invade from the east, the Germans invade from the west. Now again, this is an event that has a national history, right? No Estonian, no Latvian, no Lithuanian, no Pole will let you go to bed without reminding you of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But they remember it as national history, as the suffering of Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, and Poles, which is perfectly understandable. But once again, it's most important probably for the Jews. Because when the Soviet Union destroys these states, it creates various kinds of political potential, which the Germans can then use. This is very complicated, so let me just try to give you a relatively simple example. The relatively simple example is double collaboration. If you think about it, there had to be double collaboration. If one regime comes and it needs an administration and a police force, people are going to collaborate. If the next regime comes and it needs a police force and administration, people are going to collaborate. And in general, it's going to be very much the same people. We separate the Nazis and the Soviets in our mind, but they had many things in common. One of them was the need for a police force, right? So, and the politics of this are even stronger. Let us imagine, and I'm sorry I'm asking you to do a lot of sort of hideous imagining, but let us imagine that you worked for the Soviet regime in a place like Latvia, right? And then let us imagine that the Germans come. You have every reason to collaborate with the Germans, because if you collaborate with the Germans, you can then bury the fact that you collaborated with the Soviets. And now let's imagine that there's an ideology which allows you to do this. And here we see how Hitler's planetary ideology, as an unbelievably radical form of anti-Semitism, gets a deeper and deeper hold into local politics. If the Germans come and they say, communists are all Jews and Jews are all communists, this is an unbelievably good opportunity for all of the people who collaborate with the Soviet regime who were not Jews, which is the vast majority of people who collaborated with the Soviet regime, right? So when the Germans come with this totalitarian idea that Jews are communists and communists are Jews, local policemen who had worked for the Soviets say, yes, of course, you're right, and then work for the Germans. Now, what's interesting about this is that it's an example of how important the Jewish sources are, because the Germans don't register that they've been fooled by Slavs. That, I was fooled by Slavs again today is not something you read in German reports very, very often. But the Jews notice it. The Jews say, isn't it odd that my neighbor was a Soviet policeman and presented himself as a communist, and now he's a German policeman? And then what's even odder, the Jewish source will go on to say, is that he's blaming the Soviet collaboration on me. The Jewish sources give this scenario again and again and again and again. And one can run this argument in various different ways. There's this symbolic argument. Think now about Jedwabne, a case that you'll probably all know, July 10th, 1941. What happens in Jedwabne? Poles take a couple of hundred Jews, force them to carry a Lenin statue, right? And then the Jews and the Lenin statue are taken to a barn and burned. What is happening there? Well, Poles are killing Jews according to a German scenario. That's one thing that's happening. But another thing which is happening is the symbolic transfer of responsibility. If the Jews are made to be the communists by carrying the statue, and then they are killed with the statue, responsibility goes away. Now, what's so important about this is that it's just not true that the Jews were the communists and the communists were Jews. In fact, in the case of Jedwabne, we know perfectly well that it was Poles who gave away other Poles to the Soviet authorities. And that is, in fact, typical. Murdering Jews is a way to make your own responsibility go away, which is what happens at Jedwabne. It happens on a much larger scale. It happens in more banal examples, too. The Latvian who killed the most Jews of any non-German, a man called Viktor Arais, had been a Latvian policeman before the war, and then he joined the Communist Party when the Soviets came. He earned a Soviet law degree. It's fascinating what a high percentage of the mass killers had law degrees, by the way. He got a German one later, too. He had a Soviet law degree. Then when the Germans come, he volunteers for a German militia and ends up commanding a group which kills or is involved in killing most of the Jews of Latvia. Okay, so you see the point. Something is happening in this stateless zone. Forms of politics are possible here which would not be possible elsewhere. Double collaboration, I'm just giving you the simplest example I have. Double collaboration is only possible if there is double occupation. And then the Germans also find that they themselves can do things in this zone which they wouldn't have done elsewhere. So the Germans who round up 33,761 Jews to kill them in Kiev at Babi Yar include the regular, ordinary uniformed police from Bremen, which is brought there shortly before, has no special training for this kind of thing, and nevertheless carries out this action. In Belarus, there's a Wehrmacht unit which just a few days before had been in the Loire Valley, right, in occupied France, with those nice restaurants with the checkered tablecloths, drinking white wine. Brought to Belarus, this Wehrmacht unit not only kills Jews, it kills Jews all by itself, without the SS even being present. These kinds of examples can be multiplied, and they're crucial because even the Germans did not know that so many Germans beyond the Einsatzgruppen would kill. It's important that the Einsatzgruppen killed. They're the ones who showed the way. But in the end, more Jews were killed by ordinary German policemen than by the Einsatzgruppen. Far more, as it happens. And of course, the Wehrmacht joined. So in these stateless zones, places were found, ways were found to kill Jews in extremely large numbers. And this is how the Holocaust began. By the end of 1941, in the occupied Soviet Union, close to 1 million Jews had already been killed. And although the killing starts in this doubly occupied zone, it continues as German forces move into the Soviet Union, following the same dynamic. In Minsk, for example, in Minsk, the Germans take the Jews, force them to carry Soviet flags, take them outside the city, and shoot them. The Jews are communist, communists are Jews idea turns out to work everywhere in the Soviet Union. In Kharkiv, in Stalino, which is now Donetsk, in Kiev, Smolensk, everywhere the Germans go, this politics works. And everywhere that Jews are alive in the Soviet Union, they die at the rate of about 94%. So this is the Holocaust. This is how it starts. The question then is how it continues. As of 1942, it's a general German policy to kill Jews wherever they live. What's interesting, though, is how this policy from place to place actually varies in practice. It turns out not at all to be the case that the conditions that could be created in the Soviet Union can be recreated in other places. In Poland, it's very close. In Poland, the state has already been destroyed. No one is a citizen. The Polish police are already working for the Germans. The Judenräte are already functioning, right? And in these conditions, Jews can be taken to gas chambers and killed. But once the Germans moved beyond the stateless zone, things began to change. One way to think about this is by way of Auschwitz. We think about Auschwitz as a site of universal killing, and that's fair enough. Auschwitz was a place where Jews from all over Europe were taken to be killed. But in general, most of the Jews who were supposed to be sent to Auschwitz were not, in fact, sent there. Why? Because once the Germans get beyond the stateless zone, they have to deal with various kinds of existing sovereignty. And here's where the argument about the state begins to take on a very different kind of flow. It turns out that things that we are suspicious of, like bureaucracy, for example, help Jews. It turns out that the thing which is crucial for Jewish survival is something very simple: citizenship. So long as the Jew belongs to a state and the state does not renounce the Jew, that Jew is going to survive the Holocaust. Right? Another way of looking at this is to consider the numbers. In the stateless zone, your chances of survival as a Jew were about 1 in 20. If you're beyond the stateless zone, your chances of survival are 1 in 2. Now, 1 in 2 is awful, but it's clearly very different from 1 in 20. Another way to think about it is to make comparisons. In Estonia, 99% of the Jews die. In Denmark, 99% of them survive. That's a pretty significant contrast. It cannot be explained by a different German policy. The policy was the same. It cannot be explained by pre-war anti-Semitism. If anything, pre-war anti-Semitism would tell a different story. It can only be explained by the different character of the occupation. Or, and now I'm bringing us to the end, we can ask, who can rescue? Who can rescue? Well, citizens can rescue. If you were the citizen of a sovereign state, very often it wasn't even a crime to rescue a Jew. Or if it was a crime, it was a crime that you would probably survive if you were caught. If you're in the stateless zone, that simply was not true. Or to make the point even more strongly, who were the rescuers who could save more than 100 people? Almost all of them were diplomats, right? Not because diplomats are such splendid people, although of course many of them are, but because the diplomat's own status was secure. And the diplomat had the almost magical ability to hand out state recognition to other people, which happens in the south of France in 1940. It happens in Vienna in 1938. It happens in Lithuania with the famous case of Sugihara in 1940. Now, if you strip all the institutions away and you consider ordinary people who in a situation of statelessness, where all of the incentives are pushing towards murder, what happens? Well, some people rescue, a few people rescue, but not very many. And this is incidentally totally independent of ethnicity. This is true regardless. Very, very few people rescue. And the interesting thing about this rescue is that no one can really explain it. So I've spent a lot of the last 5 years reading the Jewish sources on rescue in Eastern Europe. And what I find striking is that Jews cannot explain why they were rescued. They cannot, even though they very often spent a lot of time with the people concerned, they cannot explain why it was the rescuer did the thing that the rescuer did. Rather than talking about motivation, they almost always talk about virtue. And the word that they use the most often is humanity, Menschlichkeit, humanity. Now, what is humanity? Humanity is the opposite of what Hitler says. Humanity is the antidote to Hitler's claim. Hitler says that in conditions of anarchy, we are simply animals, that there are no ideas which really allow for human solidarity. The people who rescued proved that this was not, in the end, completely true. And in that sense, they're exemplary, and for that reason, among so many others, we have to remember them. However, we also have to be realistic, and we have to notice that these people were very, very, very few. And this is why I don't think I can end the book with the rescuers. I end the book instead with the question of structures. It is right for us to remember righteous action, but I think it's also right for us to remember the conditions under which righteous action is so difficult. It is right for us to model ourselves on the rescuers, but I think a certain amount of humility is also called for when we ask whether we ourselves would actually pass this test, which would suggest that the way to think about rescue, or the broadest way to think about rescue, would be to think not just about example, but about causality, not just about individuals, but about social and political structures. And here is where I truly worry. If the Holocaust was, as I'm arguing it was, a result of the destruction of states, the lesson that we draw from the Holocaust might be wrong. Both on the right and on the left, we have different versions of the story which says the Holocaust was caused by a state that was too strong. What if that's exactly backwards? What if we've learned exactly the wrong lesson? Another thing related, what if many of us think that the Holocaust, Auschwitz, has something to do with the triumph of enlightenment or the triumph of science? What if it's exactly the opposite? What if Hitler denied that science gave us a future? What if Hitler's argument was that we had to forget about scientific progress and concentrate on the natural struggle on Lebensraum now? What I worry about is that at this point in time, we all have a Holocaust which fits our worldview. It's very difficult to meet a person who says, I have a worldview, but the Holocaust contradicts it. We all have the Holocaust which fits our own worldview. What I think is that the history of the Holocaust, if it's interpreted broadly, will cause trouble for everyone's worldview, but a productive, fruitful sort of trouble. I think if we learn the lesson, not just of ethics, but of structure, we have a chance of applying the history of the Holocaust in a way which makes future tragedies less likely. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Tim, I want to thank you for that fascinating talk. It's raised a lot of questions in my mind, and I'm sure that it's raised a lot of questions in our audience's mind. And I want to thank all of you for being with us here tonight, and also to our audience that's watching at home on our video stream. Now, Tim, let me start out with a kind of an easy question. What motivated you to write this book? Was it a continuation of Bloodlands? Was it the warning that you have at the end, the conclusion? Or was it to redress what you think was the kind of the ways in which Holocaust scholars have misunderstood this history?
Well, it's a little bit of all the above. So, I mean, there's no way to understand why I wrote this book except by mentioning Bloodlands. Bloodlands, as Sarah quite rightly said, is a much more descriptive book. I'm trying to show that all of the policies of mass killing that we know from the German side and from the Soviet side happened in a certain zone, that Belarus, Ukraine, Western Russia, most of Poland, the Baltic states. And I recount each of those policies. And this is essentially a kind of table clearing exercise. I'm trying to say that if we actually recognize certain basic things, like that the killing was almost entirely beyond Germany, like that the Holocaust happened in a stateless zone, like that the Holocaust happened in places where all the other German crimes happened. The starvation of Soviet prisoners of war, 3 million people. The murder of civilians in response for partisan warfare, another 1 million people. The murder of the gypsies, for that matter. All of these things happen almost entirely in the same zone where the Holocaust happens. Or if we recognize that every major perpetrator in the Holocaust also killed people who weren't Jews, right? Then we're in a place where we have to reconsider many of the things that we think about the Holocaust. We have to reconsider keeping the narrative inside Germany. We have to reconsider whether it's authoritarianism in one country or some kind of international history. We have to ask the question about the relationship between Germany, not just in the Soviet Union, but other states. And so those are the questions I ask in Bloodlands, but I don't answer them. And this is my attempt at answering them, which is just in some way an expression of honesty. If I'm going to say that we need this history to answer the question, then I should try to answer the question. The other way that it arose is that I sincerely think that this history is not only the crucial event of the modern period, but that it offers ways of understanding ourselves and our future. So, I mean, one thing I want to be very clear about, everything I have to say about the present comes from what I know about history. I don't actually pay that much attention to the present what I think I have a handle on, and I could be wrong, but what I think I have a handle on is a certain interpretation of a very important event, which is the Holocaust. And the reason I wrote the last chapter was that when I finished this book, I finished a draft at the end of 2013 and looked up, there were certain things which were quite disturbing. That China very clearly had what one could call a Lebensraum problem, that Russia was talking openly about destroying states. And if one twists the dial a little bit and wants to be really unpopular, one could point out the Americans have a problem of confusing politics and science, which is one of Hitler's major problems. So I look up at the world and I see that if you interpret the Holocaust the way that I'm interpreting it, there are some pretty obvious lessons which begin to come clear. So the last chapter was the last thing that I wrote, and I wrote it after I figured out what my argument was going to be.
I think one of the challenges in your book was the way in which you've kind of reconceived the way we should view Hitler. For instance, by saying that he wasn't a German nationalist, that he was a racial anarchist, you referred to him, and that and you talk about that. But then the challenge for me in looking that, if you look at Mein Kampf, every page is filled with him talking about the German nation or Germanness. I mean, do we exclude that, or all his countless speeches, or is that just something that he says for public consumption?
Well, I think one has to distinguish two levels here. There's the level of his theory of the races. So he thinks that we are deeply members of races, and that's all we are, right? But for the time being, we have other allegiances which are less significant. So he does think that there's a German nation, but he wants the Germans to be part of a race. He wants to take that German nation and throw it back into the racial struggle. So the folk exists, and perhaps it's better than other, folka, but he doesn't want a nation. He wants the Germans to be part of a race. And for me, there are two telling things. The first is that in the second book, he says quite openly, and this is maybe one of the reasons why the book wasn't published, he says quite openly, he's not really interested in the Sudetenland, he's not really interested in Danzig, he's not really interested in these petty border questions that animate German nationalists. He sees them, however, as a way to trick Germans into war, right? And that's how I understand him. When he acted as a German nationalist, he did a very good imitation of being a German nationalist. But his goals were not those of a nationalist. A nationalist really would have wanted to gather the Germans into the German state. That's what he pretended to do in 1938, 1939. But making war in order to destroy the Polish state in 1939, that's not actually nationalism. That's something much more ambitious. And making war against the Soviet Union in 1941 to take Ukraine and become a world empire, that's not nationalism. That's something much more ambitious. So the way I look at it is that there's a fairly clear exposition of the ideas. There's a moment of political compromise, both to come to power and then to get the war that he wanted. But then as we move into the war, the ideas that were there back in Mein Kampf begin to emerge again. Well, the other thing is that, when the war comes to an end, Hitler says some striking things. He says, well, it turns out that the Germans aren't actually superior to other people. And in effect, this turns out to be one big biology experiment as far as Hitler is concerned. If the Germans lose, then so much the worse for the Germans, and let's burn all the cities down. I don't think that's the attitude of a nationalist. If you compare Germany to, say, Romania was run by a radical nationalist, also an anti-Semite. But when the tide of war begins to change, their policy begins to change, and Antonescu tries to save the Romanian state. Hitler doesn't try to do that. He casts it all into the wind.
No, your conception of the state, I think, is an interesting one. I think that you're looking at the state perhaps in a kind of I don't want to say a novel way, but in a particular way, that the state exerts sovereignty and that its goal is, or its purpose is, to protect the rights of its citizens. But I'm not sure that, for instance, certainly it's not the understanding that Hitler has of the purpose of a state. You know, he, in Mein Kampf, for instance, he will talk about that the purpose of the state is for self-preservation, and he'll go further on that. But it's a very different vision of the state. And I'm picking up further on that. I'm wondering if Hitler coming to power in 1933, did he destroy the German state?
Okay, so I didn't stress this in the talk, but one of the things I find interesting in Mein Kampf is that Hitler makes it quite clear that he does not consider the state to be an end in itself. In fact, that he says, no race can consider the state as an end in itself. He says when the racial struggle begins, states will collapse. He says nature throws races upon the globe and sets them free to struggle, and in this struggle, political institutions will fall. It's very clear that Hitler sees the racial struggle as being incompatible with states as they currently exist. In his vision, there's going to be some kind of German state in the future, but that German state is going to be a creation of and subordinate to the German race. It'll be one more thing that the race creates, like art or technology or hygiene. It will also have a state, but the state will be subordinate to the race. And I think, you know, your question is hugely important, because it comes to a problem which in a brief talk I couldn't really address, and that's the problem of, okay, maybe you didn't find it so brief, the problem of how you reconcile being a racial anarchist and being the head of government, right? I mean, if Hitler really is a racial anarchist, as I claim, what happens when he becomes head of government? The way this problem is usually solved is by not addressing it, okay? I mean, very rarely do people ask this question, how can someone who had views of this kind actually become the head of government? And I think there is an answer, and the answer has to do with the monopoly of violence. Normally, it's not so unusual to have groups like the SS and the SA and intimidate your opponents and show that the state can't monopolize violence. That's not so uncommon. What's uncommon is that after 1933, Hitler kept these institutions, okay? So even after he was in power, the state did not monopolize violence because there were other racial institutions which also carried out violent acts. But the problem is those racial institutions cannot fully realize a revolutionary vision because Hitler needs the German state. He needs it above all to destroy other states. He needs the Wehrmacht to destroy other states. And this is how to understand the Night of the Long Knives of 1934. The SA wants to merge with the Wehrmacht. It wants to create some kind of new revolutionary army, and it wants to continue the revolution inside Germany. The SS understands that the army has its place and that one has to be patient, and that the real racial struggle is going to be outside Germany. So when the SS murders the leaders of the SA in the Night of the Long Knives, this is the victory of a certain kind of conception of the state and the race. And the conception is, we do not monopolize violence, but we do not destroy the state. We're going to use the state to destroy other people's states. And that's the solution that Hitler finds, and that's what's special about Nazi Germany. Because you're quite right. Hitler doesn't see the state in any kind of conventional way. What I'm trying to claim is that conventional states, even poor ones, even weak ones, even ones which we would find unsatisfactory on all kinds of grounds, were much, much better for Jews than those states being destroyed.
But in the destruction of these states, he doesn't leave. He creates something new out of those. So there's some type of state structure, whether you look at Austria, whether you look at the Protectorate of Bohemia, Moravia, or the Generalgouvernement, or the civil administrations he sets up in the occupied Soviet Union.
And the closer those things are to a normal state, the more likely Jews are to survive. So in Austria, interestingly, so the moment I'm describing in the talk, where Jews can be humiliated on the streets, that lasts so long as Austria is not merged into Nazi Germany. When Austria is merged into Nazi Germany and Austrian Jews become German Jews, that sort of thing is no longer possible. The same is true with the Protectorate. I mentioned Slovakia and Ruthenia because the parts of Czechoslovakia that don't join Nazi Germany are more dangerous for Jews than the parts that do. Isn't that extraordinary? The parts that do are joining the state, which oppresses its Jews, but the parts that don't join Nazi Germany are actually floating free, and radical things can happen to them that couldn't happen to them otherwise. The occupation zones in Ukraine or in Poland are deliberately designed in a colonial spirit. So the less the unit is like a conventional state, the more Jews are going to be at risk.
You raised an interesting comparison, both in the book and the lecture, which I found interesting, but somewhat problematic. That was between Estonia and Denmark. I mean, Denmark, in some ways, I think is a unique case among the German-occupied countries. But even with Estonia, I think about, in some ways, how much geography plays a role in there. In 1941, when the German troops enter Estonia, there are 4,500 Jews there. The vast majority are able to escape, so that there are 1,000 that end up. So the actual rate of survival is 75%. That survived because they were able to flee further into the interior of the Soviet Union. I think and also I think in the case of Denmark, I mean, the close proximity, geographical proximity to Sweden allows that as well as Sweden's willingness to accept that. I think it's the same thing in Ukraine too. I think that about half the Ukrainian Jewish population survives because they can flee into the interior of the Soviet Union. But so I'm kind of curious how you.
But I'm not actually trying to explain survival rates in a technical sense, because I mean, in this kind of explanation, yeah, I mean, 100% of American Jews survive too, and British Jews and so on, because the German power never reaches them. The Estonian Jews who survive by fleeing, they survive because German power never reaches them. I mean, that's an important part of Jewish history. But I'm not actually trying to explain survival rates in that technical sense. I'm trying to explain the huge difference in death rates among Jews who were there when the Germans encountered them. And that seems to me to be the significant thing. In the case of Denmark, the German occupation kills almost no Jews. In the case of Estonia, it kills essentially all the Jews who were there when the Germans arrived. So you're right, if you were writing a book about survival rates, geography would be very important. But if you're trying to explain, what I'm trying to explain is how the Holocaust was so much more intense in one place than another. I mean, in Ukraine, you're absolutely right. The further east people were, the shorter distance they had to run. But what I find more interesting than that is if you control for that, and you look at Stalino or Kharkiv or Dnipropetrovsk, the death rates are exactly the same as in Western Ukraine, right? Exactly the same, which suggests that some of the things that we think that are so important are not as important as we might think. Sweden and Denmark, I would just point out one other thing, the importance of sovereignty. So one thing about sovereign states, unlike stateless zones or puppet states, is they can change their foreign policy. Sweden, which is a neutral, begins to tilt towards the west in 1943.
Yeah.
And one way that it can show that it's tilting is by accepting the Jews of Denmark, right? So that's actually a place where the state plays a role.
Yeah, and it's also, I was looking at some records of Danish Jews in Theresienstadt, and you had a significant number that were actually stateless, or that were German, that originally came from Germany, and those were still under this kind of protection of the Danish regime. If I can just ask one more question, which is one that I was thinking about. When you talked about this, I got the impression from your lecture that it was the Nazis that promoted this notion of Judeo-Bolshevism, but it actually has much longer, I mean, it goes back to at least the Russian Civil War. Absolutely. So how much of this is a carryover that survived in those local populations, so that when it's broadcast or distributed in leaflets, or that it resonates with that population?
that's hard to sort out. But you're absolutely right. The Judeo-Bolshevik idea comes from Russia during the Civil War, comes from Russia and Ukraine. The protocols of the Elders of Zion are literally brought to Germany in 1919. You could almost tell the moment when Hitler reads them, and the Judeo-Bolshevik idea then completes his worldview because it creates the place that can be attacked, the Soviet Union. That said, I agree with you that idea was present. I mean, not only in the Soviet Union, but it was present in Poland in the 1920s and 1930s, where the church blamed Jews for not only for communism, but for socialism and all the evils of modernity. But what I find interesting is that people latched onto the idea, whether there was much of a history of it or not, which suggests to me that it was fundamentally the basic convenience of being able to blame what had just happened on someone else.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to open it up to question and answer now for about 15 minutes or so. So I think that we're going to have people in the audience with microphones. So if you have a question, please go up to one of my colleagues and they'll come by.
Thank you. When I read your book, my reaction was the Jewish survival rates were higher, where, like in countries like France, where the state continued, and lower in stateless places. But had the war continued, and if Germany had prevailed, eventually those death rates would have been comparable where there was a state and where there wasn't a state.
Okay, so let's assume you're right. Things in general don't go on forever, and so the factors that kept the Jews alive for those 4 years, I would say, are pretty important, right? So episodes of mass killing generally don't last 4 years. They're generally briefer than that. And so if we establish a factor which can keep people alive for 4 years, we've already learned something really, really important. So I'm just saying the history of the Holocaust as it was is extremely important. And if we get that right, we may learn useful things. I'm happy, having said that, I'm happy to entertain the speculation. I'm not sure it's true, and here's why. 2 reasons. The first is that with the Germans, as the war goes on, are increasingly dependent upon Western Europe for men and for supplies. And going back to the Denmark question, one of the reasons why they hesitate to intervene in Denmark is that they're getting Danish food and they're getting Danish men to fight on the Eastern Front. So I think so long as a war was going on, you would have had this need almost to make a compromise with the places where the state wasn't destroyed in 1930, 1939, 1940, 1941. The other thing that makes me hesitate about the speculation is that the turn was generally the other direction, right? So insofar as France was a sovereign state, France had an anti-Jewish policy. In 1943, it turns away from that, right? And you can say, well, if the war had turned again, they might have turned again. Maybe, but the thing that the French authorities were realizing was that if they allowed the Germans to dictate in a way who is a French citizen, who's not, they're allowing the Germans to decide what French sovereignty is. And so then, to imagine a Holocaust in France, one might have to imagine not just a German victory, but a kind of German reinvasion of France. So one ends up imagining a lot of different things. So yeah, I'm not sure. The other thing is, I mean, can the Germans actually carry out mass killing when there's not a war? They didn't prove that they could, right? Before there was a war, and even during the first 2 years of the war, no mass killing. So if you imagine that the war is over, you then have to imagine exactly how they carry out mass killing without a war going on. So it's not, it's not simple.
I think if we go up here.
Professor Snyder, many thanks for your very inspiring talk. I very much appreciate how you highlight the phenomenon of citizenship and the importance of state. And I think it's a call for us historians to deal with citizenship and Holocaust history in a more serious way. And I would say, I think in a more complex way, because I believe that a lot of what you describe is basically oriented on a one-way road that leads towards killings. Once we change the perspective and look at what is happening in the protectorate Bohemian Moravia and Slovakia, it can be much more complex. But I believe that your work is very important and it calls for discussion. Apparently, there are cases like in the protectorate movement in Moravia, it is actually the occupying power that at one moment stops the nationalizing of Jews by the government of the protectorate. So it's really much more complex. But a question that I wanted to ask you is a different one, and it is, how do the events, the violence of, say, 1918, 1919, in roughly what you describe as bloodlands, how does it fit into your concept, into your interpretation? I was surprised somewhat that you could not mention it, because in many ways you could highlight the continuity, territorial continuity, but also the continuity from the perspective of an absence of a state, which is very apparent by at the end of the First World War and the beginning of the interwar period.
Yeah. So thank you. On your remarks about the state, in the book, I argue it three different ways. Here, I basically went through the chronology in a very abbreviated way of how states were destroyed and how that enables killing. In the book, I then do two further things. I consider how in individual cases, state institutions actually work to preserve Jewish life. And then I ask how people were capable of rescue. So there are essentially three different tests of the same argument. And it basically turns out always to be true. I'm not denying that states sometimes denationalize their own citizens and that that's a bad thing. But it doesn't, on its own, it doesn't, and I would even say can't lead to a Holocaust. If you denationalize your own citizens, you still have to have a place where they can be killed. And what's special about the Germans is that they create that place, and they create it in a stateless zone. So so you have this strange kind of cooperation between policies, which are basically policies of ethnic cleansing, and then the specific German killing in the stateless zone. On the issue of the First World War, yeah, there's a chapter about that in the book. The two things, I mean, to be very brief about it, which matter the most, are the experience, the German experience of Ukraine as a colony in the First World War. In the First World War, the idea that Ukraine was a breadbasket, the bread piece, which didn't actually ever materialize in either World War, but it was a very important myth for Germany. Hitler, who fought on the Western Front, didn't know how tough Ukraine was in the First War. He bought the idea that it was a breadbasket for the taking. Another source of continuity is precisely, I mean, as an earlier question referred to, the origins of the Judeo-Bolshevik idea. You can't have the Judeo-Bolshevik idea without the specific experience of the Russian Civil War in Ukraine, which is where it arises. Now, that said, I'm hesitant about arguments having to do with the continuity of violence, because if you map pogroms or whatever you want from the First World War onto killing actions in the Second World War, it doesn't line up in any straightforward way.
Let's see. I think we'll take the first question, then we'll come to you. I think
you mentioned that humanity was significant in the recounting of survivors, those who were saved. And you also mentioned the church as promoting a lot of hate. I have a Polish Catholic friend who grew up in Poland right after the war, and whose parents lived through that, and felt that the church was very instrumental in creating the blame that Hitler couldn't have done all that he did without the cooperation of the Polish population to a degree, and Poland was a very Catholic country. So maybe in looking at history and mourning and how to prevent things in the future, if religion is used to promote love of the fellow citizens as opposed to blood libels and all kinds of other lies and hate that sometimes religion does, we might be able to prevent something like that in the future.
Okay, thank you for that. So I'm gonna say something more scholarly and something a little bit less scholarly. In writing a book like this, one has to handle all of the possible institutions, including churches. So in this discussion about the state, I also handle institutions like churches or paramilitaries or partisan armies that are somewhere between the state and private action. Some institutions which have something like state qualities to them. And here's the interesting thing, sorry about the voice. Here's the interesting thing about churches. It doesn't seem to matter very much whether it was a Catholic church or a Protestant church in occupied Europe. What seems to matter is whether the church before the war was a majority church or a church that was attached to the state. If it was, then it tended not to behave well when the state was destroyed. The religions that were minority religions or which were separate from the state or persecuted by it tended to behave better during the war. So interestingly, if you just look at Poland, you would not be impressed by the Roman Catholic Church, I'm afraid. But if you look at France and the Netherlands, in the places where the Catholics were in a minority, they were more likely to rescue. And the same is true of the Protestants. It's not that Protestants rescued exactly, that's kind of a myth. It's that Protestants rescued where they were in a minority before the war. And then in the East, in Ukraine, churches which tended to rescue disproportionately were not even really churches. They were tiny denominations which were often illegal in the Soviet Union, like Baptists or Studentists. Now, here's something a little bit less scholarly, but still not entirely personal or groundless. Polish Roman Catholics who rescued, and of course there were thousands of Polish Roman Catholics who rescued, very, very often cited the parable, so often that I don't even think it can be a coincidence, very, very often cited the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? Which is an extremely interesting passage in the New Testament. I mean, it's basically like, it's a Jewish discussion of law. You have a bunch of Jews talking about which law is the most, like in Leviticus, which is the most important of God's laws. And Jesus wants to argue that the most important of God's laws after loving God is loving thy neighbor. And he tells this story about the Good Samaritan. And in the story of the Good Samaritan, a stranger helps a stranger. And having told this story, Jesus asked the disciples, who was the neighbor? And the disciples say, he that showed mercy. And Jesus says, go forth and do likewise. And what I find really interesting is that Polish Roman Catholics, when they're asked to explain why they did what they did, they very often cite that passage, which means that they're thinking religiously, but on their own terms, because that's not what they got about probably from their parish priest, right? In some cases they did, but in general, the idea that the Jew as their neighbor was something they would have had to work out for themselves from the actual text. As many of them, in fact, did. Oh, actually, it appears over and over and over again.
I think we've got a question up front.
I have 3 quick questions. First of all, I have cough drops if you would like one.
Oh, yes.
Additional questions are, first, with this discussion on sovereignty, would you say that a case could be made for that the stronger a nation's sovereignty is, the more likely they would to be to stand against Hitler and against the idea of being overtaken? And then completely removed from that question is the question of, I as a person with a disability, find the Holocaust especially poignant to study. Walking through the medical experiments upstairs was one of the hardest things I ever did as a young adult. Do you feel like one of the ways that it was why people were able to kind of turn their heads is because of the inhumanity issue, that people with disabilities were described as contagious or monsters or things like that, and therefore people were more willing to turn their heads because that was the first group that was removed.
Okay. First question, sovereignty. So what I'm trying really hard to argue is that even weak states are much better than no state. And the state that actually resisted Hitler in the end, Poland in 1939, was not a strong state. It was it's actually rather a lot like Ukraine today in many ways. It was not a strong state. It happened to be the state that resisted Hitler. Czechoslovakia was a much more functional state with probably a better army, certainly a better arms industry, but Czechoslovakia chose not to resist Hitler. So I don't think it has anything to do with, you know, the strength of the state or the sovereignty. It matters, you know, the way that I would look at it is that the fact that Europe lost Austria and Czechoslovakia meant that the European order was falling apart, and that Hitler could feel the European order was falling apart. The way that I look at 1938 to 1941, and this is different from other Holocaust books, is that I see that as a crucial moment where 6 European states disappear from the map: Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And when 6 states disappear, and those are 6 states where there are a lot of Jews, you're looking at the end of the European order, and you're also looking at the prehistory, I think, of something dreadful for the Jews. As to disability, there are 2 ways that it plays directly into the history that I'm trying to tell. I can't answer your question directly, but there are 2 things that are maybe relevant. The first thing is that when I talk about the 1930s as potential, what I'm trying to say is that we shouldn't treat the 1930s as an end state, as the creation of some kind of perfect or efficient or authoritarian or national Germany, because that's not how Hitler saw it. That's not how the SS saw it. That's not how the Nazi Party saw it. They saw it as preparation for something else. And part of that preparation was what they thought of as racial hygiene, right? So if you're going to have, you know, so this is how it fits in the argument. If you're going to have a racial struggle, one of the things you do, besides preparing the racial elites or the SS, is that you purify the race, right? And that is the logic under which the persecution of the handicapped was pursued. And then the second connection, as I'm sure you know very well, is that when we get to the end of 1941, then the Holocaust is already underway, and the German leadership, Himmler, is looking for, I wish I had this cough drop an hour ago. Thank you so much. You should have waved it. The camera wouldn't have caught it. Well, it probably would. The cameraman would have anyway. Next time I'll just sit next to you. The second way that it's connected, as I'm sure you know, is that when we get to the end of 1941, and Himmler is looking for ways to reduce the number of Germans involved in the killing, the technique which is available is a technique which was used for T4, for the murder of for the murder of people who were classified as life unworthy of life, right? And that the technology they had developed was gassing by carbon monoxide from canisters, and then they changed that to kill Jews for carbon monoxide from automobile engines, from truck engines or tank engines. But that's the direct institutional link, and there's a personnel link because the number, it's something around 200, but a very significant number of people who were involved in the project of killing the disabled were then sent to the new death facilities for the Jews, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. So there's a technique, and there's also a personnel connection between one and the other.
I think we've got one question down here. Christy, do you? And this will be our final question for the...
I was hoping not to have that pressure. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation tonight. I was curious if you could comment a little bit when focusing on Poland about the role that the government in exile had in a place where it was occupied territory. There were no state structures yet. It ended up having the largest underground in all of Europe with the Polish underground. There were efforts from London to have the Polish underground army create Żegora, which helped Polish Jews, and was also the only territory, as far as I know, but maybe I'm mistaken, where coming to the assistance of Jews was punishable by death immediately. That was not the case in other Western European countries, in the case that it was in occupied Poland. But how did that dynamic of having a government that was in exile in London work in occupied territory that was resisting from 1939 to 1945?
Yeah, so it's a great question. In the middle of the book, it goes back a bit to your question about the details. In the middle of the book, I try to work out fanatically how every little aspect of sovereignty had some effect on the Jews, because I'm trying to pursue this argument that sovereignty as such matters. And with the Polish, with the Polish government in exile, you have this trace of sovereignty, right? When you have a government which is legally recognized by its allies, at least, and that has two consequences that matter for the Jews. I mean, so let's just be very clear: the destruction of the Polish state back in Poland is a total disaster for the Jews. And the people who are reporting to the Polish government in exile, who are honest about this, like Jan Karski, make this perfectly clear. But and also, to be very clear, it's not that the government in exile was particularly concerned about Jews. And in fact, that's part of my argument. It's not that the government likes Jews, right? You're not going to find too many governments in the time and place who like Jews. The point is that sovereignty as such is much better for minorities or for Jews in other situations. So in two ways, the government in exile helps Jews to survive. You mentioned one of them, which is Żegota. There are not that many policies actually explicitly designed to save Jews in Europe, right? I mean, the Americans had one. Poland had one. I'm not sure that there were any others. Maybe someone can correct me. So Żegota was initially a social endeavor centered in Warsaw, designed to provide food and other supplies to Jews who had usually Jews who had left the ghetto. It saved a few thousand Jews. It was taken in by the Polish government under the codename Żegota and became Polish policy. It's an interesting kind of Polish policy because the way it worked was that Polish soldiers were airdropped over Poland by the RAF with money belts full of money, which came from the joint. So it's actually an interesting example of like the cooperation of the British state and the Polish state and Jewish civil society in the United States, right? And then that money was given to Jews with some success. So that's a state policy. If there had been no government in exile, no Żegota. Second thing is, although the Polish government in exile did not, distinguish the Holocaust from other crimes against Poles in general, and we wouldn't want to overstate this, there were some reports, including Karski's, which made it very clear that something special was happening to the Jews in 1942. And this was some of the information which led to the Allied warnings in December of 1942, which probably had something to do with not Germany changing its policies, but with Sweden tilting and taking Danish Jews. And it probably had something to do with other countries changing their Jewish policies in 1943. So in that way, the existence of a Polish statehood, no matter how attenuated, actually did have some effect.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. This was wonderful. I also want to let you know that Tim has graciously offered to sign his books right outside. And so thank you for that. I want to thank you as an audience, both here and those that are watching at home. And also if those people are interested in watching this again, you can see it on our YouTube channel. So thank you very much. And don't forget to see Tim on the way out. All right, thank you.